Thank you ever so much for coming and participating and listening to what I'm going to go over this evening. I've done this presentation quite a few times, but not recently. And I believe there are a few new things that have added into this since the last time I did. So let's go ahead and get into it. Volusia County in World War II, and what an amazing story it is. On the upper right-hand corner, I want to point out that's probably one of the last remaining beach houses, a guardhouse, a watchtower. That one's up in Ormond Beach. On the left are women in the Army, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and later on the WACs. They dropped one of those A's and just call it the Women's Auxiliary. At Daytona Beach, yes, they were there. On the middle left, a WACO glider from World War II. That's going to enter into this as well. So tugboats on the bottom right, the whole county was cooking during World War II. And it's been said that if you didn't have a job in World War II in Volusia County, you just did not want to work. And it effectively ended the recession. So, in other parts of the country, in addition to Volusia. Next slide, please. Okay, just a quick disclaimer. Photographs are from everywhere. The DeLand Naval Air Station Museum, the West Volusia Historical Society, the Land Historic Trust, Inc., and all over the place. I just borrowed them for whatever purposes and sources. This is an educational, fair use presentation. I am not giving copyright permission to anybody, but they're here for us to enjoy for educational purposes only. Our thanks to everybody. Next. Every once in a while, I'm going to throw in these fun little graphics in here. This one was set them on their axes, no pun intended, I'm sure. And then there's Hitler. Let's catch him with his panzers down, which is funny unless you were looking at one of those Panzers in a Sherman thinking, this is not good. Next. World War II Coastal Watchtower. There it is again, just to give you another shot of it. In the middle, there's a blue armband. I actually have one of those at home. I thought about wearing it tonight and said, nah, it's just fairly trivial, but it's a neat thing to have. There was a civilian group that was inducted to do these things, to watch for the enemy. And yes, they were there. Next. When Chamberlain came back and told everybody in 1938 that he held a contract with Hitler that said peace in our time, he was doing exactly what the people in England wanted him to do. Winston Churchill was saying, you can't trust Hitler, and he turned out to be right. But Chamberlain at the time, Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of England, was doing exactly what people in England wanted to have done. They didn't want to go into another world war. They had 1 million casualties from the first one. Their entire generation was crippled, far more percentage-wise than here in America. But it would come to us after December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. All of a sudden, everywhere across the country was in full alert. If you've seen the funny movie with John Belushi, known as 1941, they did with it on the LA coast, and it's hilarious. But there was a real fear about things going on. And this is a tanker off the coast of Florida. In 1942, we didn't even have a program in place to turn off the lights along the coastline. So the German U-boats came up and just started sinking all the shipping by the silhouette off of the land, lights that were on the land side. They would frame these tankers up and they would take them out. Next, please. This is defamatory, but it's true. It's a period piece promoting Central Florida grapefruit juice. And keep in mind that the entire aim of propaganda at that time was to endear hatred of the enemy. We used derogatory names. So did they. Back in World War I, we called the Germans Huns, a derogatory comment, which was interesting since we shared a heritage with them to a certain extent. But I wanted to show you this one because it came from Florida. Next, please. Mounted sailors patrol the Florida coastlines. These are not our folks in Volusia County. They're from the St. Augustine area, but identical purpose. Sailors on horseback patrolling the coast. Well, what would they be looking for? Next slide. They'd be looking for these guys. Nazi saboteurs. They were actually caught. And there were two different groups. A group on the left were the Florida boys, came ashore close to Jacksonville with explosives, and they were out to do some dirty and mean and evil things. Same thing for the group in New York. They were executed. And that was the last large-scale attempt that was made to bring groups in to sabotage the area. Next, please. Those 5 people on the top are some of our best military heroes from West Volusia. If you go to our Facebook page, West Volusia's Military Heroes, you'll see about another 145 others. Half of them gave their lives. The other half were heroic or did wonderful things in the military while serving the community. Upper left, Lieutenant Charles Bailey, Tuskegee Airman. Next to him, Captain Gould. I mean, you know, Miss Gould was something else. Frank Gould. Next to him, Brigadier General Harold Mace. That's right, Brigadier General from the longtime Mace family. And he was basically promoted all the way up. He was a 1926 DeLand High School graduate and had been in the service when the war started and moved right up because he was a trained B-26 pilot. And those things were widowmakers, especially early on. He made a tremendous contribution. And his last job in World War II, Chief of Staff, 7th Air Force, United States Army Air Corps. That's incredible. Next to him, Captain Harry Greeno, killed in the war, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross and several air medals. And to the right, Lieutenant Maxwell, Wallace Maxwell, who also was killed in the war and earned a Distinguished Flying Cross. But when the war started, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, December 7, 1941, and by the way, let me clarify this, this was completely expected and even predicted in many cases. When people use the term sneak attack, you need to read up on that a little bit. They knew it was coming. They didn't know exactly where it was, but they were real close. The Great Depression ended. Everyone had a job. We would become the arsenal of democracy for the entire world. Key to that effort was the amazing amount of military projects and bases that came to Florida. Good weather, flying days were available for everybody with really good weather, a good workforce that was technically skilled, and Volusia County was ideal. We had 2 naval air stations, Daytona Beach Naval Air Station and the DeLand Naval Air Station. Fortunately for us, we actually have a museum. The DeLand Daytona Beach Naval Air Station does not at this time, which is kind of sad. There were all kinds of things going on, and not just on the east side. Of course, we had steel tugboat productions. On the east side, they built United States Navy subchasers. They were all made out of wood, so they're long gone. In DeLand, we had a contract for U.S. Army WACO lighter production. And then there was something that nobody knows about called the DeLand Industrial Pool, which was a consortium of all kinds of craftsmen and builders, including Lake County, that would take small contracts and just build a variety of things for the military. Nobody remembers that. We're going to talk about those guys a little bit later. We had training for pilots at Embry-Riddle. The Army officers trained at Stetson, and thousands of young women in the Women's Auxiliary Air Corps trained in Daytona. In fact, about 8,000 ladies went through that program. They weren't all there at once, but they were there, and they were certainly an attraction to all the young men in the area. Daytona must have been hopping in World War II. I just would kind of like to have been there. But the 5 men up on the top are extraordinary. Captain Gould earned a Navy Cross, and the other 4 Distinguished Flying Cross. Next, please. There were pilot training areas everywhere along the east coast of Florida, from Jacksonville all the way to Miami. And they reserved part of the Pensacola area as well. Now here's what's interesting, and I'm going to show you a map in a second. The Army Air Force primarily trained on the West Coast. The Navy was primarily on the East Coast, okay? Thousands of pilots died in these crashes. In fact, the number is about 15,000 were killed in crashes and training long before they got into the war zone. And the bottom right's a crash of one of the planes at Daytona Beach. Next, please. This is a map I spoke of. They've kind of done a curlicue up in the middle there for landing. But on the right-hand side are all the Navy facilities, all up and down, all the way to Miami, from Jacksonville to Miami. On the right-hand side, you'll see some of the Army facilities. A little bit of overlap, but for the most part, Florida became an aircraft carrier for the Army and the Navy. It's amazing how many different facilities are out there, because each large facility, like the DeLand Naval Air Station Museum, had several auxiliary operations, bombing ranges, that kind of thing, that they maintained as part of the process. It wasn't like there was just one DeLand Naval Air Station. They were all over the place, including Lake George. Next. Here's a map that shows some of the outlying areas and a little bit more detail. Naval Air Station DeLand would have 31 crashes. Daytona Beach would follow up with 25 crashes. And in many cases, the pilot and crew were killed. Pilots that had issues with flying, and most of the planes they used were fairly stable platforms, but they were learning and they had engine failures and that kind of thing. They did their best to come down over water. So they had all kinds of rescue craft in Lake George, off the coast of Daytona Beach, everywhere. Everywhere there was a lake, there was a possibility of a plane going down. They had facilities. Next, please. Let's start with Daytona Beach and the east side. Subchasers, pilot training, WACS, DeLand Naval Air Station, Daytona Naval Air Station, I'm sorry. And yes, prisoners of war. There's a wonderful photograph of Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University during World War II. Next, please. Okay, be careful what you say. You never know who's on the wires. Knock the Heil out of Hitler. My smiling face is obscured part of that, but knock the Heil out of Hitler. Let's keep him pulling for victory. One thing I'm going to share to you about propaganda. Everybody did it. In World War I, we had all kinds of propaganda come over here about Germany that was absolutely wrong. Why? The only working underground telegraph line was coming from England to the United States. The Germans had no way to get their propaganda over here for even to be picked up. So the British had a great time putting out all kinds of stories that we now know were completely fake. When someone talks about a given country getting involved and doing things right or wrong, the more you read about stuff, it gets really confusing at times. World War II, we had to win. Then there was no doubt that we were in the right. And we used whatever it would take to get it done. Next slide, please. Daytona Beach Boat Works was built early in World War II. They were active until at least the 1950s. Next, please. The boat works, according to what I read, and this is debatable, but I'm going to give you the quote. was the largest employer in Volusia in World War II. Had to have been huge because the staff out of the boat works on Lake Beersford were 300 plus, 24/7 crews quite often, overnight shifts and everything else. But the Daytona Boat Works and Daytona built sub chasers. 17 were built, they're all gone. This is not a photo of a Daytona Beach boat, but it is typical of what they made. Next, please. The sub chasers, 110 feet long, no frills, plywood hulled vessels. They're like a PT boat and every bit as fragile, no armor, but they did have weapons and they could run at 20 knots. Now, they had depth charges, but you know what? Got to admit, of the 438 sub chasers built during the war, only one was credited with destroying a submarine. And it turned out that that boat was built in Daytona Beach in 1941. But that's when you think about it, you had 438 sub chasers built and you only got one sub. I don't think that was really cost effective, but maybe the fact that they were out there patrolling made a difference. They also earned the E Award for Excellence, only given to the upper 5% of World War II contractors. The Beersford Boat Works, the American Manufacturing Corporation, also earned an E for the all-steel tugboats. We'll get to those in a minute. Next. Pilot training at Embry-Riddle. Photo on the right is what it looked like in World War II, and the Embry pilots would have used it, no doubt. Next. Let's put Hitler in the trash. Save your old metal and paper and help put the lid on Hitler. Okay. I skipped the really mean ones. There were some that were just, yeah. And there was a lot of hate involved. And the mission at that time of anyone involved in propaganda was to develop hate for the enemy. And we did that pretty well. Next, please. Here are the ladies. 8,000 women would join the Women's Auxiliary Air Corps. They dropped the word auxiliary. And there was, because we had the flag, a chapter of this group in DeLand. And that flag, along with a mannequin, is proudly displayed in the DeLand Memorial Hospital and Veterans Museum, which is now open for tours, free, noon to 4. You must have a mask. And there's a group limit of 4 or 5. They just don't want to have large group tours at this time. Next, please. On the beach, in the band. Okay, next. Parade rest position. Playing reveille or taps, I'm not sure which. Next, please. Here they are, and I don't think I had this one on the last presentation. Life-saving team. Pretty cool, huh? Next, please. Once again, on Daytona Beach. Looks like the military's taken over. I can't imagine what this place looked like or what Daytona looked like with so many military people running around, just everywhere. Next, please. All right. The billets, a billet is like the list of the roster of women or men in a given group. They could be in a training unit, that could be called a billet. But basically, some groups accepted Black volunteers, others did not. Now, I want to point out that's a rare instance of integration prior to the complete military integration that happened after World War II. A little bit unusual here. I also want to point out that quite a few men were not receptive and were disrespectful. I mean, after all, they'd only just barely allowed the women to vote. Here they are trying to be men and all of that. So I'm being sarcastic, of course. 150,000 women would serve in World War II as nurses or WACs or waves. There were all kinds of ways that they could get involved. Okay, I think it's time that we play this little film that I've got. Discovered this, and it's fantastic. It tells stuff about the WACs and, most importantly, the prisoners of war that were in Daytona Beach and in several other locations throughout Florida. German prisoners of war.
At this point, I think we ought to head up north to Daytona, because Daytona was an unusual POW camp, which combined the Halifax District Hospital and what used to be a WAC base, originally being found as a training base for the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. They were later changed over to the Women's Army Corps, and a year after that, the base was closed and all the WACs were transferred up to Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia. The women's barracks were located adjacent to the Halifax District Hospital, where many of the women trained as nurses. Located directly behind the Halifax District Hospital, other buildings were built and added onto it, and it became the Welch Convalescent Hospital, where military members could rehabilitate after they were injured. Here, they could attend concerts put on at the band shell that had been recently built by the Works Progress Administration during the Depression. One of the newspapers at the time dedicated a whole article to the fact that the Army was going to rent City Island baseball field from the city and revamp the lighting so that they could use it as part of their reconditioning program of the soldiers in the convalescent hospital. They stated that the work was going to be overseen by none other than Cy Young, and the coach was going to be First Lieutenant Robert Earl Grace, who played for Pittsburgh and the Phillies. But Daytona Beach wasn't all just World War II fun and games. There was a large naval air station with training held by Embry-Riddle, plus, of course, Coastal Patrol itself. After the WACs had moved out, the U.S. Army Signal Corps Training Center was opened. Here, Army members trained in the latest forms of signaling, like pigeons. And then there was Welch Convalescent Hospital itself, where POWs worked as orderlies on the ground. And it was quite a large camp, too, with 5 barracks, each containing about 51 men. And one of those POWs was SS Panzer Grenadier Werner Jentz. Again, like fellow SS member Fritz Dreschler, Jentz had no desire to return to his part of Germany either. Jentz had quite the little outing on his escape, first hitchhiking to New Smyrna Beach from Daytona Beach. From New Smyrna Beach, he hopped a freight train and headed south towards Miami. I mean, Jentz surely had to know, like everybody on the East Coast did, that Miami was one of the major training sites that was just crawling with military police. Jentz later said he spent his time swimming and looking for work in the city of Miami. I'm not sure at this time in Miami how he expected to find a job where he wouldn't have any interaction with the military. The place really did have a large contingent of military police, both on foot and motorized. But in the end, it was local law enforcement that caught Jentz sleeping in the back of a truck. During his week's vacation in Miami, Jentz had been the subject of a massive FBI manhunt. The Daytona Beach Evening News had described the SS trooper as an ardent Nazi. And at 6 feet 2 inches tall, when most of the Germans were 5'6" or 5'7", he could seem fairly threatening. The FBI special agent in charge, R.G. Danner, also told the press that Jentz, who was 22, had been an SS member and may be dangerous. But the press was also quick to point out that Jentz was the only prisoner ever to escape from Daytona. Throughout 1945 and into 1946, the folks at home were reading about escaped prisoners in the press on a regular basis. And they were seeing the FBI wanted posters on the walls of post offices all across the United States. In addition, articles in the press were telling Americans how much better POWs had it than they did, as the federal government asked Americans to sacrifice things through rationing so that the boys overseas could have what they needed. And the folks at home did their best. They knew they couldn't get steel anymore, so wooden bumpers were used on cars. Fuel was rationed. You had to have a certain ticket to be able to get any kind of fuel, if it was even available. And Americans were being forced to ration their food. And while not exactly happy about it, Americans at least understood that there was a need for food for the GIs to keep going. So they were willing to put up with the inconvenience.
How do you turn it down? How do you turn it down? It just clicked
Okay.
out.
Sarah, how we doing?
Something cut out.
Diminish that down. Okay, here we go. This is a welding class that was held at Bethune-Cookman.
Where's the volume controller?
Okay, next please. That's another shot of the housing that was actually in that last video. Next please. Yeah, I'm unmuted. All right. Okay. Next, please. Daytona Naval Air Station. Couple of crashes. They had a variety of planes. The one above is a Ventura subbuster, and they would go out off the coast looking for subs. And if I understand correctly, they were fairly effective as a deterrent. The plane looks to be a Hellcat fighter. Those types were in the Daytona Naval Air Station group. But keep in mind that depending upon what was going on, planes would fly from one naval air station to the other in training missions. And you might have on any given point in time, all kinds of aircraft sitting around your runway. Upper hand right, that is the logo for one of the groups at Daytona Beach. In fact, that one, if I can read it correctly, actually is the one for the Daytona Beach Naval Air Station logo. Next, please. This is Bill Timmis. He would end up earning a Navy Cross for sinking a Japanese battleship, which I thought was noteworthy. So I got his picture there, and he's a handsome guy and did a good job. Daytona Planes had DF as their identifying logo on the actual plane. And that upper picture is one of the few photographs that are still around of a large number of the folks that were stationed there. Next, please. There's the airport in 1944, already fairly complex. 1, 2, 3, 4 major runways. Next, please. Advanced training for naval aviators and for air crew of the Navy and Marine Corps. All kinds of planes, F-6 Hellcats and Corsairs and Helldivers. And we had dive bombers and Venturas at the DeLand Naval Air Station. So aircraft are constantly going back and forth on different missions and training and this and that. Next, please. German POWs. As we mentioned earlier in the film, there was actually a prison in Daytona Beach, all of it controlled from a central coordinating office in Camp Blanding. And they had English classes. And you know what? A lot of them would come back after they, basically had to go home and deal with all that. A lot of them would end up coming back. I liked it. Next, please. Okay, let's talk about the west side, the prettier part of the county. Oh gosh, did I have to say that? Yeah, I'm biased. But that would include the American Machinery Corporation that built the tugboats, the war boats as we call them, because they did a lot of good things in World War II. The Babcock Aviation Corporation, WACO gliders, We talked briefly about the DeLand Industrial Defense Pool and the DeLand Naval Air Station, all major components of the West Side effort. And of course, this picture is of our fantastic restored Memorial Hospital and Veterans Museum, which is also showing the Veterans Plaza and Gardens. And just to the right of that gazebo, if you were to go out there today, you will see our new Veterans Memorial Wall that within a couple of weeks is going to have our first 40 tributes installed. So when you get a chance, come out and take a look at that. We're real pleased with the way that's worked out. And I'm going to be really happy to get all those tiles out of my kitchen. Next, please. Lake Beersford today. That's part of the old dock. Next, please. This is the earliest photograph we have of tugboat construction. There they are, down near the water. Earliest known photo, May 15, 1942. So within 6 months of the attack on December 7, we were making tugboats here. And the spark plug of this whole thing was a guy by the name of B.D. Olson, who's in the middle of the upper photograph, who was portrayed so eloquently by our very own Tom Roberts in the stage presentation a couple of years ago. I have that on video, and he just did a wonderful job. Of course, I wrote the script, but you know, he did a great job, and it's memorable. But B.D. Olson was incredible. And after World War II, it would continue on with other investors as the Olson Corporation for many, many years. They actually had one military tugboat contract after World War II that turned out very strangely. We don't have time for that today. Moving on. When I talk about a big photograph of people, well, here they are. And yeah, this is a panorama that we put together into 3 components. It was about umpteen feet wide, and we have the original, but we've shot it down. We can put it all on one screen. There is the coveted E Award that the AMC earned. Once again, commendable in how quickly and how well those tugboats were built, even though they were never designed to be watertight or to be used in open ocean conditions. Of course, the Army ignored all of those things and used them precisely in those areas, which is why some people lost their lives. Next, please. Here it is during construction. Some of the boats up there, of course, these buildings are all gone except for one. One small building still exists from World War II. Everything else is gone. On the bottom are some of the tugboats that were actually put into the water, and then they would finish the fitting while they were floating around. They could start working on the next batch after that and keep production going. They would produce 29 all steel tugboats during World War II. And I think they were working on a final 3. They ended up going to the United Nations. Good production for such a small facility. Next, please. They built them in batches, 6 to 9 tugs at a time. All steel. It was fantastic. They could bring the steel in on the railroad system, build these things quickly. They could build an all-steel tug in a few days, and it would take weeks, if not months, to build the same thing in wood because it had to be handled differently. It had to be aged properly, it had to be treated properly, and building a wood tug was a time-consuming process. Next, please. First 2, they're being launched September 7, 1942, 9 months after Pearl Harbor, and we're putting tugboats into the water. Now, they're getting ready to go into the water sideways. I think I have the photograph of that, but just in case that I don't, because they had a fairly deep draft, and these boats never had the engines installed. They were towed out of Lake Beersford into the St. Johns River, all the way up to Jacksonville, where they would install the engines and they would sink down another 2 feet. At that point, they had a 9-foot draft, but they were in deep water. They were handed over to the Army, and they were great for inter-harbor use. The Army used them for everything. Next, please. Here's one at launch. Sideways. Couldn't put them in nose first like you would expect to see. Nope. 7-foot depth right there. They put it in nose first. They had to dig them out. Next, please. Unique photo. Now, this is moving under its own power, so either somebody went up to Jacksonville and took some images, or it came back down for a special hoorah because all the guys have their best suits on that are on board. Next, please. Great book, Tug of War, $5 on eBay or Amazon. Joe Richards, I met some people that knew him, talked a little bit about what an amazing guy he was. This book details the incredible adventures of this guy and one tugboat, one all-steel tugboat that was built exactly to the same pattern as the ones we built on Lake Beresford. And he got a job as a captain. Fun story. He's interviewing, and the officer says, "Well, why should we hire you? You don't have a whole lot of experience." And he literally said, "Is there a line behind me?" The answer was no, because everyone knew better. Even getting crew for these top-heavy tugs was a chore, and they had to lie a little bit. Okay, but here was his task. Okay, take this all-steel top-heavy tugboat down to the Panama Canal, get through the Panama Canal, come all the way back up to LA, and then we want you to come from LA. We're going to mount some heavy machine guns and ammo boxes on top of your already top-heavy area, and then we're not going to give you a chronometer and send you 2,400 miles to Hawaii. You'll have a radio. The fact that he survived is incredible. And he's the one that historically I look at as to complete verification that these things were so top heavy, they should never, ever have been out in the ocean. Next, please. Now, tugboats, how did they get to Europe? Well, they were picked up by this crane, which was a World War I battleship known as the Kearsarge. And they turned it into a crane ship in New York, and this thing could lift 100 tons. Well, that's kind of what a tugboat weighs. Next photograph. There they are. Look at them. 2 little tugboats on the back of a Liberty ship headed for Europe. Okie dokie, good idea. That worked well. They got about 50 of them over there before somebody had a better idea. Next. There were a batch of 8 tugs, 672 through 677. 2 of them capsized and were lost in the North Atlantic. And the crew were probably cursing the day they ever got on the thing. 676 and 677 actually survived World War II, even though they were in something known as Convoy New York 119. The book is on the left. It's $15 on Amazon. It's an unbelievable tale of survival at sea, which just happens to include 15 small tugboats, including 2 of ours built here on Lake Beresford. Next, please. This chart was in the book, and this is how I verified the numbers. They had them numbered. And some really, really smart Army officers said, look, we're wasting all that space on the back of those Liberty ships we can use for other things. Why don't we tow these small tugboats over to over to Europe behind a large tug. It worked really well in the summer. Then they tried it at the end of September. 4 small tugs towing 3 to 4 tugs and barges at 6 knots. It would take them a month to get across. It's kind of like, hey, let's go walk to Europe. Next, please. ST-474. There's a crew, wonderful photograph of a DeLand boat. I need to finish the story really quick about the convoy. The second time they went out, they managed to get crew for all the tugboats. The weather got worse day by day by day. And the waves got to be 50 feet and then 60 feet. And they're so far out, they can't possibly turn around and go back. They might as well just do their best to get through it. Well, 200-foot tow ropes from barge to tug to whatever, and they were all just being towed except the tug at the front. Well, with the wave action, what would happen is the ropes, they would get out of alignment. And whenever they snap back together, it would just pull the tug under. They didn't have time to correct. They lost 1 tug and the crew, about 8 people on each one. They lost a second tug. The waves are not letting up. They lost a third tug. By this time, the tugboat crews that are still alive are somewhat demoralized by all this. The commander stopped the convoy. He'd already made an emergency call to England saying help, and 2 ships came out. The English Coast Guard, whatever their name for that is. And once they got out into the water, they radioed the commander and said, "Hey, mate, this is just too much. We're going home." And the commander said, "Roger," click. So even the British couldn't help. The commander of that convoy made the right call. They had enough fuel to load up the small tugs. From that point on, they would not need refueling. He cut them loose. And the remaining 12 made it. With the help of the USS Mason, a destroyer escort, they had an all-black crew that was assigned to get the 12 in. The waves had started to break their destroyer in half. They came out with welding torches and saved their own ship, and then turned around to shepherd the 12 tugboats into safety. Unbelievable story. Get the book. Next. The most famous of our tugboats, ST-344, undoubtedly was at D-Day Normandy off the coast at 7 o'clock when the invasion started. They would not go in until the next day, but they were there off the coast, taking the risks along with everyone else. And then they built the docks off of the coast of Normandy that really are what helped us make that invasion a success. 9,000 men died on D-Day. They died for a reason. When the docks were built, men and materiel just got poured into that area. And this little tugboat helped make it happen. Built right here in DeLand. 6 weeks later, off the coast of Cherbourg, France, they hit a mine. Most of the crew would have been killed. If you were below decks, you weren't coming back up. Too hard to get out. I have a photograph in the museum of one young man that I referenced out. His photograph is there, and He was killed on that sad day on the land ST-344. Next, please. There it is again. She hit a mine off the coast. Don't know how many were exactly killed. A few would have survived. 16 of these warboats definitely went to Europe of the 29. 3 capsized, but at least 6 still exist in the world. Next. Okay, now I'm in contact with the guy and I'm still involved with him on Facebook, but I haven't heard a whole lot about his offer. He made an offer a few years ago to put Tiger ST-479 in his will to go to the Land Historic Trust for us to return it back home, which I'd love to do. But it's in Sweden. So if you happen to have $500,000 and, you know, the tug is free, but getting it here, but I'm thinking it could be a National Geographic special, okay? Old tug comes home from World War II. Wouldn't that be cool? All right, so let me know if you're ready to do this. I'm all for going to Sweden. I like Sweden. I've been there. It's a nice place. Has some really neat social things. Oh, wait, can't be political. Moving on. Next. Help beat the Axis with prophylaxis. Okay, you two can do your thing. Don't give AD. All right, moving on. WACO U.S. Army glider production. Next. V.C. Babcock was an amazing man. When I started doing research on this gentleman, he knew Wilbur and Orville Wright. He was the number 5 man to ever fly in America. Came to DeLand, ended up getting a contract. He built some planes like this one above, built in DeLand, 1939. You know, he was building prototypes and doing all kinds of aviation thing. And then he decided to build WACO gliders. WACO had designed these and they were contracting production out across the country. So with this background, the U.S. Army said, great. Next. So they were standard WACO gliders. They built them in a large tent at the old fairgrounds. Bottom right is a picture out of the West Volusia Historical Society book showing them being towed out, probably out to the airport. And on the left is a construction photograph. Upper right, a blank tag for the glider, ID tag. Next, please. They did more than just build gliders, and Babcock was instrumental in building the defense pool, where they built Navy parts, Army parts, aircraft parts, anything the military wanted, they would ask DeLand if we wanted to build it. Next, please. Here are the WACO gliders. And being a glider pilot and actually getting into a glider was gutsy. Remember, you're only going to have one attempt at landing. Yeah. Next, please. There were quality control issues. The welds weren't solid. The Army sent down 2 officers to investigate. And they had a fire that broke out, destroyed a bunch of the production out at the fairgrounds. They just seemed to have one problem after the other. And the Army finally canceled the contract. They did not get an E award. And the source that I researched on this in the book that talks about gliders indicated, next slide, please. That's oh yeah, and quite a few were damaged at the airport. Next, please. Yeah, all that damage cost the government $51,000 per glider, when $53,000 would buy a new P-51 Mustang fighter. And if you know aviation stuff, it's hard to compare the two. So you can see why the Army did close it down. Next, please. Give him a whiff of his own BO, Blitzkrieg offensive. Okay. Next. DeLand Industrial Pool. Here's Mrs. Earl LaRoe of Eustis, a grandmother, doing daily shift work in the family's garage. She's making worm gears for Army aircraft. Loose Confederation did all kinds of stuff. Millions of dollars of military items were made during the war. I didn't know anything about this when I started doing this research. Had never heard of it. Not mentioned anywhere. Next, please. County fair buildings were used for all kinds of things, and DeLand Industrial Pool got some of those. They loaded the elephants and sideshows up, and they went on the road a week earlier in 1942. Next, please. Freeing up all those buildings to make stuff. And we did. This is something going to U.S. Army Corps. Next, please. Air Corps. Military project, industrial pool again. They could basically do whatever someone needed. False bottoms for naval destroyers, engine housings, propellers. They did all kinds of stuff. Next, please. Here's an aluminum furnace with a group working in Daytona Beach that were part of the DeLand coalition. Next, please. Aircraft engine repair in DeLand. These guys look like they're having a party and not working, but you see the point. Next, please. Aircraft construction class, welders. Next, please. Casey's Machine Shop, never heard of them, down by the railroad tracks. Was one of the strongest members of this group, producing $3 million worth of war production without a single rejection. Let me say that again slowly, because that's a lot of money for 1941, $3 million of war production. That's amazing. Next, please. These guys are creative, and everyone back then solved their problems. They needed a welder, so they took an Overland chassis, mounted a Dodge motor, attached a Studebaker radiator, and then got a generator set up, and hey, they're ready to go. Improvisation. Next, please. Cars Machine Shop, another group. Next, please. DeLand Naval Air Station. That's a Douglas SBD, that dive bomber. And DeLand Naval Air Station crew and the Ventura subbuster on the bottom right. Next, please. They became functional about the same time as Daytona did, December 42. Upper right, PBY Catalina, the big old boat that you see quite often in the Pacific arena. Well, we had one on Lake George, Lake Crescent, to pick up downed aviators. Officers' quarters, bottom right. We had PT boats and smaller boats and all kinds of stuff on these lakes to save the people that went in them. Next, please. The Douglas Aircraft Corporation Dauntless, which SBD is Scout Bomber Douglas, in case you wondered. This is the one that won the Battle of Midway. We sent in our torpedo, our old and slow, outclassed torpedo bombers in first. The Japanese took all of them out except maybe one or two. But while they were dealing with that, our dive bombers came over the top of their aircraft carriers and took out a total, before the event was over, of 4 aircraft carriers. And that was a major blow to Japan at the time. Winning the Battle of Midway had a certain amount of luck to it. I want to see the new version. I have not seen the new version of Midway yet. But it was a turning point in the war, and anyone that has studied it, looked at it, said, you know, there was a whole lot of luck involved here. And there was, and many, many reasons. Next, please. But those are what we had in DeLand. Now, this appeared collage, and I'm going to apologize because they've got black kids on the upper left eating watermelon. World War II stereotypes. But there's a large number of photographs. We had Navy on the bottom left on a pier. There's one of the rescue boats, and a smaller one on the right-hand side. I believe that one was in Leon Springs. These military folks were just everywhere. Next, please. The Land Naval Air Station built all kinds of buildings. It ended up being repurposed. Florida Military School was out there. Popel's furniture was out there. There were all kinds of buildings. And I mentioned Popel because he was an incredible man in World War II and a Marine who ended up coming here. And the bottom right, that is a fire truck from the DeLand Naval Air Station that was donated to the city of DeLand that we see in our parades every year. Next, please. All right, I am 5 minutes over, but I did pretty good, 8:05, and now these are all commercials at the end. Come visit DeLand Naval Air Station Museum, see a tomcat, or come visit the DeLand Memorial Hospital and Veterans Museum, and especially our Wall of Honor outside, which within a couple of weeks is going to be looking pretty good. Okay, Volusia County did its part. Time for questions, if questions are going to be allowed.
So, yeah, if Sarah wants to admit, she can see if she has questions and ask a question.
Any questions? I'll do what I can.
Hello?
Hello.
I have a question. Jody Williams got a question about whether Mary McLeod Bethune was involved in any of the efforts to integrate the troops over in Daytona Beach, the women or the men. Do you know anything about that?
The one thing I could tell you is she interacted very, very closely with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor and Mary Bethune and others were constantly pushing the envelope in terms of getting things done. There is little doubt that Eleanor was involved in the U.S. Navy experiment with an all-black crew that worked out tremendously well. She also was supportive of the Tuskegee Airmen, and Lieutenant Charles Bailey, who ended up moving to DeLand and was here for many, many years after World War II, was in Bethune-Cookman, and I have little doubt that she encouraged him and others to sign up for the Tuskegee Airmen program. 450 black pilots served in that organization, and they did remarkable things equal to anything that any white unit accomplished. It's been said for his unit that they never lost a bomber under their protection, and no one's ever challenged that. Anyone else? Do I see Mark Shuttleworth up there? Hi, Mark. Yeah, let's get a little bit closer here. Yeah.
Okay, now I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Speak up just a little.
Can you hear now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think I just unmuted. Yeah, I was late getting in, and I apologize for that. So I missed the first part of your meeting, but I enjoyed the presentation. I've spent a lot of time around Lake Beersford, and I appreciate your clarifying all the issues with tugboats in that area.
Well, it's when I retired from teaching in 2011, and yes, I missed teaching, so this is fun. I ended up doing the research on the tugboats and was amazed to find out with the internet how much I could discover. And it's
Yeah.
all online on our website. So, any other questions at this point? Anything I can clarify or add to?
I just had a question about the boat that you were involved with in Ormond Beach, and I'm not clear on. I had several telephone conversations with you, and I was
Yes.
so busy on other projects that I just couldn't get involved at that point.
Let me tell you how strange that ended up. Okay. We discovered it, made contact with the old captain. He passed away, left it to his wife. We went over, met with her.
Right.
He promised to donate it to us, to our group, and we said, we will get it out of there and we'll save it. She reneged on the deal, sold it to a guy locally. And we were like, okay, it'll get saved. Well, this guy never got it moved. And eventually it leaked into the Intracoastal Waterway, in which case the state got involved. And as you might imagine, they were not exactly happy about this.
Yes.
I had told our board, we got to get every bit of that fuel oil off of that tugboat. Bottom line was, I don't know how the finances worked out, but the state came in and removed the thing, contained the oil spill, probably sent him a heck of a bill. And then apparently it was headed out into the Atlantic, down around Florida, over to Texas, where it was going to be environmentally treated and then sent out supposedly as a reef off of Texas. And that would have cost a fortune. Okay, it would cost a fortune just to get it there to Texas, because they'd have to tow it. So, and I sent an email a couple of years ago to the reporter that had done the story. Can you tell me if this ever happened? And she never got back to me. Kind of one of those, I wonder what happened to that tugboat question. That I'll put on my list of things to do, Mark. I'm so curious. Where did they go? We could have had that. I mean, and it was a United States Navy tugboat, but highly identical to what we had. Everyone's giving me the signal. I'm out of here. So I appreciate your participation and being a good audience, and it's kind of good that you can't talk back to me. I like that part. Thanks so much.
Thank you.